All right, welcome to the Expert Witness Podcast. I am your host, David Smith, and I'm here today with Jon Marshall. Jon has a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering and an MBA. Over his 19-year career, he has been listed as an inventor on 77 published patents and has many successful product releases. Much of his experience has been in the oil and gas industry, developing new drilling tools for Schlumberger. If anyone listening is familiar with the industry, one of his most successful products is the rotary steerable tool called NeoSteer that you can find on Schlumberger's website. And I think we'll hear a little bit more about that today. Jon, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. And thanks for the invite. It's been a pleasure so far to work here at Alpine Engineering and Design. And I'm excited to share a few gems that I've picked up over the years.
That's great. I'm excited to hear your thoughts on our subject today, which is how an expert gains respect from those he works with. Here at Alpine Engineering, we have a lot of experience in both product development and expert witness litigation work. You clearly have expertise in product development, and though you're just getting your feet wet in the litigation side, I have noticed as we've interacted that you have instilled many of the same skills that I've seen are necessary for success as an expert witness. So I think what you have to say will be very applicable and interesting to the experts in product development and in litigation. So the question that I want to talk about today is, how do you gain respect as an expert?
Well, obviously, you can't just pretend to be an expert. You really have to put in the time, the educational requirements, and the real world experience in order to really be an expert in your field. But assuming that we're talking to people who are already experts and would hope to gain some additional respect for their expertise, I think I have three important things that I thought we could talk about today. So the first one is the importance of being confident, but also respectful to those around you. So most people that we interact with are experts in their own field or their own environment, and we need to respect that. And then they will instill or show that same respect to us. Though it is kind of difficult to always feel confident when you don't really look the part.
What do you mean, look the part?
Well, I've always looked quite a bit younger than I really am, which, some people I think would think that was a really nice thing to have, especially as you get older. But having a few gray hairs is really nice in some circumstances. So I think back when I was about 10 years into my career working with Schlumberger. I remember going to this rig. We were doing a test for a tool that we had been developing. And, at this point in my career, I was leading a group of about 35 individuals, both engineers and machinists and testing personnel, and had probably 40 patents to my name. And so, I think had the experience and expertise to be respected by others. But, when you walk in and the driller later told me that he thought I looked 20 years old, it's just hard to immediately invoke the respect that you would hope for in that situation.
Yeah, I totally understand that. I've been there. So when you get into a situation like that, what have you found is helpful in gaining the respect of the other people in the room or on the site?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, first, I'll say what not to do. I don't think it's effective or helpful to get defensive or tout your credentials or try to use big, impressive words to kind of impress someone, especially someone like a driller who, just isn't impressed with stuff like that. So Um, I needed his help to make sure that I was successful in this test. And it was really important that we did what we set out to do. Let me just give it a little background. We had been developing this tool for several years and probably spent, several millions of dollars trying to get this tool to the point where we could launch it as a product. And in the oil and gas industry, they're very cautious, both for safety and just cost for the customer. When you introduce a new tool and something breaks, it sometimes is days of tripping the tool back out of the hole, trying to troubleshoot it, and they just don't have patience for that. So you really have to like know that your tool's going to work. So we had done all sorts of testing before this point, and at this point we were just supposed to go there and put it down hole in a real drilling rig and make sure that it actually did what all of our previous tests said it already did. So I really needed him to be engaged and excited and not skeptical the whole time and questioning everything we were doing. And put forth his best effort. And I had seen other projects die at this point, even though you've had good data up to that, previously. If you get to this point and you fail, often they would just cut the project, feeling like, it really wasn't going to work. So, get back to your question. If you really want to gain respect in a situation like that, you have to demonstrate both your confidence and your respect for the other person in the course of working together. And in this case, it happened quite early in the process. So we had just installed the tool in the drill rig, tightened up the joints, started the pumps, and the tool worked in such a way where if you varied the flow in a specific order, it should respond. And there was a physical reaction to that response where we should be able to visually see that the tool was working. And we went through that process and nothing happened. And he did it a couple more times and nothing happened. And at this point, I'm kind of freaking out, wondering what could possibly go wrong. And of course, he's thinking there's something wrong with the tool. And he's looking at me like, I knew that you didn't know what you were doing, this little kid that came onto my rig. And, I also knew that he wasn't too excited to be there in the first place. We had started kind of in the evening and he had to stay up all night to do this test. And I'm sure he would have been happy to go home and go to bed. And so he wasn't very motivated to make sure that, we figured out what was going on and to move forward with this test. So I took a few deep breaths and thought through everything that was going on. I knew I had assembled everything correctly because I had done it myself. I had someone there with me and we had gone through everything twice to make sure it was done. It really wasn't that complex of a mechanism. There really wasn't a reason for that to have occurred. And the only thing I could, where all the evidence was pointing to was that there was something wrong with the rig, which is a really difficult thing for me to go in and tell this guy who had been, who was the expert on this rig that there was something wrong with his rig. And so I knew I had to, based on my own expertise, that I knew this tool. I had designed this tool and built this tool and tested this tool. And though I was not the expert at drill rigs, there was evidence, physical physics that dictated that there was no way that my tool was at fault at this point. And so I just had to kind of barrel through, hoping that I wouldn't lose all the credibility I had with this guy if I somehow was wrong at this point. So I confidently asked him to double check and make sure that he hadn't accidentally left open a bypass valve, because the evidence showed that the only way this should be happening is that the pressure wasn't high enough in the tool to activate. And the only way I could think of that was happening is that there was something going on, because the flow rate should have been such where the tool should have activated. So I kindly asked him to please go double check, and he somewhat with an eye roll said he would do it, and he went off. And I remember sitting there for 10 minutes or so waiting for him to come back, thinking, man, this is the worst test. I'm going to go home and look embarrassed. My boss is going to be embarrassed. We had spent so much money at this point, and if I was wrong. But I just remember the look on his face and his body language as he came back with his sheepish expression, saying, yes, I did leave the bypass valve open. I don't know how that happened. We don't ever do that, but you're right. And I could have been, I told you so at this point. But I think if to make this respect mutual, I just graciously thanked him for not giving up on me and on the tool. And from then on, we just had a great experience together. And he, his condescending attitude completely disappeared at that point. So
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. I can picture that whole interaction. Being able to say, "Hey, you're wrong," in a way that doesn't make you or them look like a jerk is really an underrated skill for an expert, particularly in a trial setting where often the way that you present something is just as important as what you're actually presenting. So that's a great tool and tip for doing that. So you said confidence with respect was the first of three things to gain respect. Uh, what's the second thing in your toolbox?
the second thing would be to learn how to say, I don't know.
So an expert saying, I don't know, sounds a little counterintuitive. Can you give us a little more information on what you mean?
Yeah, it does feel a little funny to say that, but I'm sure all of us have seen how poorly and how quickly someone loses respect from everyone around them when they start exaggerating their expertise or just lying about what they actually know. Um, I had an experience where my first person that I was working for as an intern was a very smart guy. He was the type of guy who would take textbooks on him to Hawaii and read them on the beach while he was sunbathing, right? He just loved learning and he loved experimenting. He like built his own like plane, had a shop in his garage. He just loved all sorts of things. But and he had so much wisdom. I learned all sorts of good principles from him. And at first, I just took everything he said as like gospel truth, right? And I just applied it and thought he was just the best. And after a few months, I realized how many people would gripe about him and not like him, the other engineers in the office. And I was trying to figure out why. And I started noticing him not telling the truth. As an intern, it's hard to like recognize that when you don't know anything. But after a while, I just saw him just doing all these little lies all the time, right? So if someone brought up a subject, he would just pretend to know all sorts of things about that, and he would say things like they always do it that way, and you'd ask him who they were, and he wouldn't know. He just had all these funny phrases that he would use when he started to lie, and I started to pick up on that. And after a while, though he had so much good information, it was just so difficult to know when he was lying and when he was telling the truth. And I just couldn't handle it after a while. You just had to go find someone who would tell you a straight answer if you really wanted to know something. And I think anytime we're in a situation where we are asked if we truly know a subject, the best thing to do if we don't is just to say, no, I don't know that subject. I don't know that answer. I know this, and I could research that for you, but to try to lie and assume that you know more, you just instantly lose respect of everyone around you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important, particularly in this field, to know what your limits are and to not present yourself as an expert in things that you know nothing about. Uh, the attorneys that retained you want to know where your expertise is and isn't. Uh, if they have to bring someone else in to cover something, they want to know that well ahead of time rather than once they get to trial. And so being able to say, that's outside of my scope, or I don't really know the answer to that at this point, is something that's critically important to a good expert. All right, so first 2 points have been pretty dead on, I think. What do you consider your final point in gaining respect?
Yeah, the final point I would make is just it's kind of a soft skill, I guess. These other ones are more just like honesty and trying to treat people nicely. But this one also, it's persuasive communication. And I see it as two different things. One is, I think, as experts, we tend to use jargon and big vocabulary words or vocabulary words that are the purpose of them is to help communication between two people who share the same background, the same expertise. But when you start to talk to an audience, lawyers, even just, the common people, anyone, and you start using big words they don't understand, it isn't a way to gain respect. If anything, it reduces your respect with them, where they start to feel less, and that's the last thing you want to do. And so that I think that's a huge part of persuasive communication is to use words that people understand that you are communicating with. And the other part is to not be a robot. I think often as engineers, as people who are very technical, very logic based, we think that everyone will be so excited about our conclusions if we very systematically lay out the logic. But if we do it in such a way that is unrelatable to the people around us, then we either, lose their attention or they just it's hard for them to feel persuaded by someone who is not showing any emotion or excited about what they're talking about. And so I think we just need to be comfortable showing our emotions and using persuasion when we're sharing our opinions.
Yeah, that's great. I remember there's a quote. I don't remember who said this quote, but they said people buy based on emotion and justify it based on logic. And so if there's no emotion, if you can't appeal to their emotion at some point in your presentation, then odds are they're not going to buy your story. So that's great. Can you give us an example of where persuasive communication helped you gain respect in your field?
Yeah. When I first started working with Schlumberger, it was really awesome. I got to interact with some experts in their field, and one of them was a rotary steerable system expert. That's what he had done his whole career, and really great guy. And I really enjoyed working with him over the years. But as I observed him attempt to try to explain some of these concepts and his ideas of where the next step or the next, step change in oil and gas drilling technology, he could he could talk to a whole room of engineers and we'd all be lost and we wouldn't know what he was talking about because he would just be, just throwing up equation after equation, not explaining himself, and then using these vocabulary words that I wasn't very familiar with. Maybe some of the other guys were, but coming into it, it was just like overwhelming. And I remember sitting down with him for several hours, just asking him question after question, trying to boil down what he was really talking about and pull out some principles that I could apply to a new design. And I came away from that meeting with a few real key things that he believed would help and was able to apply those to a solution. And it ended up being a pretty simple solution, but it was something that they had never considered before. And so I really was excited that, I'd come up with something that I thought would really work, but I was quite intimidated because I had just watched him present to this group of people, which I needed to present to as well in order to um, basically fund the project and get buy-in so that I could continue doing it. And there was about 6 senior engineers and business representatives in this steering committee that we had for these for the group that I was working in, and they never seemed excited about what he was talking about, and I was just thought, well, maybe they just don't like rotary steerable systems, right? Like maybe they just think it's a stupid thing to work on. But so when I went into the presentation, I made a detailed 3D model of what I had in mind and created some pretty clear slides. And I was just amazed when I started going through these slides and I explained exactly how it worked and how it related to all the principles that this expert had been talking to us about. They just got so excited, and I was just amazed. I saw this over and over throughout my career, but this was the first time where I realized how powerful it was that I was able to boil something down in a way that the whole audience could understand. That nobody was lost. Nobody was trying to figure out, what that equation meant. That you could. I think that one of the most persuasive things that an expert can do is boil something down that is difficult to understand in a way that anybody can understand. And I think that's true, what true expertise should enable. Not that, we only can talk to those who are familiar with it, but that we can talk to anybody about it. And so I think between, using appropriate vocabulary words or defining those, and then getting excited and showing it in a concise way. That meeting led to a really successful product where it's called, you mentioned it at the beginning, it's called NeoSteer. It has been if you go to Schlumberger's website, they tout it as the step change in rotary steerable systems, and that it's the most advanced and effective steering tool in the market. And it all started in that meeting when I was able to boil something down in a way and present it for a group so they could get behind it instead of wonder if they didn't know what I was talking about, right? So I think that's what it really means to have persuasive presentations or communication.
Oh, that's great. Uh, and that's a couple of those principles have come up fairly often in these interviews that we do. The idea of de-jargoning or taking all the technical terms out and explaining it with layman's terms is it can be really difficult to do when you're talking about something that's very technical. And so being able to do that, like you said, is a mark of true expertise. And then being able to present with a little bit of passion, a little bit of true belief in what you're talking about, definitely helps the audience understand what you're doing, where you are going with your opinions. So that's all great. I agree with everything that you're saying. And I guess to sum up, your 3 suggestions for experts to help gain credibility are confidence with respect. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know, and using persuasive communication.
That's right. I really believe doing those things will really help experts in all their communications and really establishing good rapport and respect with those people that they work with.
Great. Well, John, thank you for being here. Thank you for discussing how to gain respect as an expert witness. Now, assuming someone listening might need your expertise in the oil and gas industry or some of your other experiences, what's the best way for someone to get in contact with you?
Yeah, so it's pretty easy. Just go to alpineeng.com and you can look at my CV and see what projects might be in line with what you need, or just call our office 801-763-8484 and ask for John. And I'd be happy to discuss any design challenge or litigation case that really fits in my niche.
All right, John, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate you being here and taking the time out of your day and sharing your stories with us. Uh, I, I know I've enjoyed it, and hopefully everyone else has as well.
Thank you very much. It's great.